Hi, this is Jeff Mann, and I'm producing episode 6 of my video project where I discuss the golf swing biomechanics used by professional golfers. And the topic of this video presentation is going to be related to the role of the trail arm in a professional golfer's downswing between P4 to P7. And I believe very strongly that virtually all professional golfers use a lead arm swing in action. It's also referred to as a TGM swing in action, and the word TGM stands for an abbreviation for the golfing machine. And Homer Kelly in his book described different ways that one could perform a golf swing, and he stated that if you performed a swing in action, then you were using the lead arm to perform the swing in action. And I will have more to say about how a professional golfer performs a lead swing in action when I do my video presentation using my webcam. But I'm going to start off by discussing a number of capture images that I have, and I'm going to start off with Scottie Scheffler here. And image 1 is, you can see my mouse pointer. I'm going to wiggle it around so you can see which part of the image I'm referring to. So here is Scottie Scheffler in image 1 at his P4 in backswing position. Here he is at P4.5. Here he is at P5 when the lead arm is parallel to the ground. And here he is at P5.5 in image 4. Now, the first role function that the trail forearm can perform starts at the end backswing position. And you can see that Scottie Scheffler has his lead trail upper arm abducted away from his chest. He has a roughly 90-degree bend in his trail elbow, and his trail forearm is angled roughly 90 degrees relative to his lead arm and club shaft. And in a previous video, I described that Scottie Scheffler uses the intact left forearm flying wedge and geometrically flat left wrist technique. And at the end backswing, his club shaft's in line with his left arm, and that represents a left forearm flying wedge. And the function of the trail upper arm at your end backswing position is to support it. So you can see his forearms angled at roughly a 90-degree angle relative to his lead forearm. His trail wrist is bent backwards so that it's parallel to his lead palm. Now, as the downswing starts, as I said, I perceive that Scottie Scheffler is using a lead arm swing in action while maintaining an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat lead wrist alignment. So he's pulling the club shaft down from P4 down here is image 4 is at P5.5. Now, the one thing you notice that Scottie Scheffler does, as do most professional golfers, is they maintain that 90-degree lag angle. That's the angle between the lead arm and the club shaft, which is roughly at a 90-degree angle. They maintain it all the way to close to P5.5 before they start to release the club. Now, what makes it easier to maintain that angle is if you move your right trail forearm and trail arm in perfect unison with the lead arm. So what you can see Scottie Scheffler doing is, as he starts the downswing, he adducts his trail upper arm towards his trail shirt seam, and he reaches the trail shirt seam somewhere between P5 and P5.5. He also maintains this roughly 90-degree angle during that time period, and that allows him to more easily keep the club shaft and the lead arm at a 90-degree angle. If he straightened his trail arm during that period, that would most likely cause the club shaft to start releasing too soon, producing an early release called casting. So that's the second function of the trail upper arm in the early downswing, is to help a golfer maintain the clubhead lag angle of 90 degrees. The third role that the trail arm can perform during the early mid downswing is, if you look at Scottie Scheffler, he is shallowing the club shaft to a shallower plane. So at the end backswing position, his club shaft is slightly steeper than the turn shoulder plane, and he shallows it down towards the elbow plane, and he gets to the elbow plane roughly by P5.5. Now, to shallow the club shaft, while he keeps that sort of roughly 90-degree angle, he has to supinate his trail forearm. And the amount of supination required depends on how much a professional golfer shallows the club. The more you shallow the club, the more you would have to supinate the trail forearm. It's also dependent on your grip. So if you had a stronger trail hand grip at the same comparable position here at P5, the trail forearm would be more supinated. Scottie Scheffler uses a weak trail hand grip. Say he doesn't have as much trail forearm supination in comparison, let's say, to a golfer like Dustin Johnson, who shallows the club shaft to a lower plane, and he also uses a stronger trail hand grip. So that's the third function of the trail forearm. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And here's an image where Scottie Scheffler's at his P6 position. Here he's at P6.5, and here he is at impact. Now, what happens in this time period, if you look at Scottie Scheffler, he's starting to release the club. And as he releases the club has to move on the functional swing plane. And to do that, as he starts to release the club, you look at him at P6.5, he has a small degree of lead forearm supination happening, and that allows him to keep his club shaft perfectly in line with his lead lower forearm's radial bone to the amount necessary to keep his club shaft as it releases on his functional swing plane. Then in the late downswing between P6.5, he also has to square his club face relative to his club head path by impact. And at P6.5, you can see it's still open, and at impact, it's square. And what he does in the late downswing between P6.5 and impact at P7 is he uses a lead forearm supinatory roll motion to rotate the club shaft about its longitudinal axis so that the club face can be squared impact. During this time period, you'll notice that his lead trail forearm here is supinated. And it's still supinated at P6.5 and at impact. So this club face squaring phenomenon is being performed by the lead arm. The trail forearm is not performing a pronatory motion to square the club face. And what the trail arm has to do, as I said, it must maintain a supinated relationships through the entire P6 to P7 time period in order to keep the club shaft on the functional swing plane. And what allows his trail palm, if you look at P6.5 and compare it to P7, you can see that as the club shaft continues to release and as it rolls counterclockwise due to his lead forearm supinatory action, the trail palm is rotating counterclockwise in perfect synchrony with the lead palm because his trail palm faces his lead palm across the club handle. And that phenomenon happens at wrist level due to a counterclockwise trail wrist roll motion. Now, let me summarize what I've described so far. I said at the end backswing, the function of the trail arm is to support the lead arm and the club shaft at the end backswing position. As the downswing starts, the lead arm is adducted towards the trail side, keeping the trail arm bent roughly at a right angle, and that allows a golfer to maintain a clubhead lag angle of about 90 degrees to P3, P5.3. Some golfers get further down to P5.5 before the trail arm straightens. Then in the late downswing, the trail arm is going to straighten, as you can see here in these three images. And when it straightens, it has to remain continuously supinated without any pronatory roll motion to allow the club shaft to remain on the functional swing plane. Now, I'm going to discuss two other issues. What role does the trail arm play in relationship to generating swing power? And the other issue I will discuss is what role does the trail arm play in closing the club face relative to the club head path by impact. So I'm going to go to the next image. And this is an image signifying the philosophy of Brian Manzella, who describes his swing ideology when it comes to trail arm motion in the late downswing. Now, what we have here in the top graph are wrist angles, and the green graph represents the trail wrist. And the trail wrist during the downswing becomes flexed, and then through impact, and this vertical line represents impact, it moves from being flexed to becoming rapidly extended in this swing action. Now, you'll notice there are three graphs here called alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha refers to a torque being applied to the club shaft in the plane of the swing plane. In other words, if you imagine the club shaft moving along the functional swing plane like here, there's a plane board, and if your club shaft moves from P6 to impact and it remains on this plane board representing your functional swing plane, any force being applied against the club shaft by the trail arm on the aft side, pushing the club shaft towards impact, would represent an alpha torque. A beta torque refers to any force that is perpendicular to the functional swing plane, and a gamma torque refers to twisting the club handle about its longitudinal axis. Now, what I want you to notice here is that Brian Manzella, in his release technique, believes that there should be a positive alpha torque in the late downswing here. And you can see it's positive all the way to just before impact, which means that he believes that the trail palm should be applying a push action against the aft side of the club shaft in the late downswing. And if you notice what happens, look at what happens through impact. Because the trail palm is pushing the club edge through impact, you'll notice that in his release action, which he calls a rotation about the coupling point, and the coupling point is the midpoint between the two hands. So you can see here the lead arm in this little image is sort of stalling at impact, and the trail wrist is straightening, and you can see through impact the club shaft passes the lead arm. And so what's happening here relative to the two hands is that the lead hand is actually pulling back on the club handle away from the target, while the trail hand straightens through impact, you applying an active push force against the shaft. And that's what Brian Manzella believes should be performed in a golf swing. Now, where did he get this idea from, that there's such a thing as a positive torque, an alpha torque happening in the late downswing? And Brian Manzella derived this belief from Steve Nesbitt, who did a research study where he studied, I can't remember exactly how many, I think about 5 amateur golfers, and he used a computer modeling technique of inverse dynamics to work out what he perceived were the forces acting on the golf club by the hands during the downswing. And Steve Nesbitt, based on his calculations, stated that a golfer would be applying this positive alpha torque in the late downswing. Now, there are a number of professional golfers who teach this technique called the rotation about the coupling point hand release action, other than Brian Manzella. So this image actually comes from Richard Franklin, who's an acolyte of Brian Manzella, and there's Michael Jacobs. And they both adamantly believe that a golfer should be performing a positive alpha torque with the trail hand in the late downswing up to impact. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And in this image, I'm demonstrating the late downswing of Mike Malaska. And Mike Malaska also teaches what he calls a right arm throw motion. And he believes that in the downswing, you should be throwing your right arm through impact, and you can see what he's doing. So just before impact, you'll notice he looks like he might be borderline pronated. If you look at his trail forearms, lower radial bone, it looks like it actually could be pronated at this position. But certainly through impact, notice how he straightens his wrist, throws the club shaft past his lead arm, which is essentially stalled at impact. And when he gets to this position, you can see how the left wrist is bending through impact and the trail arm is straightening. And this is an active throw action, applying an alpha torque, a push force to the back of the club shaft. Now, Mike Malaska, like Brian Manzella, is free to teach this technique. But I personally believe that this phenomenon does not happen in professional golfers. And why do I harbor this belief? So I'm going to go to the next image. So now things are going to get a little complicated because this comes from Sasha McKenzie, who's a renowned biomechanist. And what he did, he took a major winner who was performing a driver swing, and he obtained the 3D images of that golfer's golf swing action when swinging a driver. And then he used the process called computer modeling process of inverse dynamics, where you work backwards to work out what are the forces that a professional golfer is applying to the club handle during the downswing. And Sasha McKenzie stated there are two forces in play. And the one force produces linear work, and the second force produces angular work. So this is his graph showing the linear work performed during the downswing. So this is just at one position. So here was the club at the end backswing position. The orange line here represents his hand arc path. So you can see the hands move down this path, and this orange arrow shows where the lead hand is moving down the path. And when the lead hand moves down the path, it's obviously pulling the club handle down the path, and that produces work. And so if you look here on this graph on this side, you can see he's got something called force along the path. So this red graph shows the amount of force that this particular professional golfer was applying at every moment during the downswing, like this. The blue graph represents linear work performed by this golfer, and the amount of linear work correlates with clubhead speed. In other words, to generate a maximum clubhead speed with a driver, a golfer wants to maximize the amount of work he does. And in this particular golfer, if you look here at impact, which is here, you can see the blue line ends up at about 238 joules of work. Now, this position of the club is at the P6 position, and at this point he's performed 134.3 joules of work. And at that point, the clubhead speed is 99 miles an hour. Now, on this x-axis, he has the distance traveled by the hands between the end backswing position and impact. And you can see it's the club head hand arc path is probably about over 1.4 meters. So the amount of linear work you do by the left arm swinging down towards impact and therefore pulling the club handle towards impact depends on the length of your arc. The longer this hand arc path, the more opportunity you have to generate linear work. And it also depends on how fast you can swing your lead arm down the hand arc path. And in this golf at impact, he generated a clubhead speed of 120 miles an hour, I think. And the amount of linear work required to do that was, remember this figure of 238. Now, I'm going to go to the next graph. And this graph here is what's called angular work. You can see here on angular work. Now, how does a golfer perform angular work? According to Sasha McKenzie, angular work is performed by the hand couple. And I will demonstrate this in the video presentation. You might not clearly understand what a hand couple is. But basically, the hand couple is, if you look at your two hands, it's like Scottie Scheffler coming down between P4 and P6. The two hands are facing each other across the club handle, and they sort of parallel to each other. But the point between the two hands, which is called the coupling point, is also more commonly referred to as the mid-hand point. And what you can do during the early downswing is you can apply a torque in the direction of radial to ulnar deviation of the lead wrist, and I will demonstrate it. And that torque produces angular work. It's actually quite complicated to understand this, but if you look at the club shaft here at this position, and you look at the club shaft here at this position, it's rotating, you can see here, 184 degrees around what's called the instantaneous axis. And you might not grasp this, but this red line represents the instantaneous axis about which the club shaft rotates during the downswing. And that axis changes continuously. That axis is actually drawn through the center of mass of the club head, which is this red dot here, and it's changing its angle. Now, even if you don't understand it completely, I want you to notice something very important, is that the red graph here represents the amount of torque that a golfer is performing during the downswing. And you can see it's a positive. When it gets to this point here, you'll notice it becomes 0. And after this point, this is probably just after P6, between P6 and impact, this torque actually becomes negative. Now, the blue curve represents the amount of work that applying a torque with the two hands via the hand couple mechanism is performing. So you can see that by the time he gets to this position here, he's performed just under 60 joules of work. But notice that by the time he gets to impact, the work performed by the hand couple is actually diminishing. It's only 30. Remember, I said that the amount of work performed by the lead arm performing linear work was 238 joules. So the hand couple is performing only a fraction of the total work applied to the club handle to generate a club head speed at impact of 120 miles per hour. Now, look at this graph. I mentioned to you that it's negative in the late downswing. And the closer it gets to impact, the more negative the hand couple torque is. That totally contradicts the opinions of Steve Nesbitt and Brian Manzella and Mike Jacobs. And I tend to believe this. I believe that and I will explain what the trail forearm does to apply a hand couple force, but that hand couple force is only applied in the early downswing to roughly this position. In this particular golfer, it crosses the 0 line at P6.1 or so. Some golfers, it might cross it at P6, and other golfers at P5.5. And this is critically important because we are going to discuss, and I will give a demonstration of what I perceive the trail arm is doing in terms of performing work so that you could swing faster and generate a faster club head speed at impact. Now I want to go to the next image. And this is an image of Will Zalatoris. So here's Will Zalatoris at impact. Here he is at about P7.4, and there he is at P7.7. Now, as I mentioned to you, during the late downswing between P6 and P7, the trail forearm remains supinated. And that allows you to help guide your club shaft that it remains on the functional swing plane. And you can see that here, his club shaft is still on the functional swing plane and even there. And you can see that his trail forearm remains supinated, even all the way to here. Notice he does not pronate it. Now, this is not obligatory. I'm just describing how he performs his downswing action. Now, the other thing I mentioned to you that Will Zalatoris uses the intact left arm flying wedge technique combined with a geometrically flat left wrist. And when he comes into impact, he still has essentially a geometrically flat left wrist and an intact left forearm flying wedge. And if you look at him here, you'll notice the club shaft still more or less in line with his lead lower forearm. So he still has a left forearm flying wedge, which is intact, and a geometrically flat left wrist. And that, you can see, allows him to keep his club face, which is square at impact. And here he is, well past impact. That's more than 2 feet please impact. And you see the club face is still square to his club head path. And even all the way to P7, you can see he doesn't let the club shaft pass his lead arm from an angular rotational perspective. And he essentially is using the intact left forearm flying wedge to well beyond impact, right? He's definitely to here and maybe even to P7.7. Now, to do that, how does he do it biomechanically? And I believe it's performed by the fact that he's swinging his lead arm continuously towards the target, slightly inside left, in his early follow through. And what he's doing basically, if you look at his lead arm here, he's swinging it at a speed, at a velocity, an angular velocity that matches the angular velocity of the club head. So let's presume the club head here, club shaft, was traveling so that the club head was 120 miles per hour at impact. After impact, the club head still has a tremendous amount of forward momentum. And what he's doing by moving his left arm in perfect synchrony with his club shaft, he maintains this relationship. It's not obligatory, it's just one technique that professional golfer uses. Now, I believe that the trail, you can see what's happening here. He straightens his trail arm to a certain degree, but not fully. And he maintains an extended trail wrist and doesn't allow it to straighten. Now, that requires an amazing degree of flexibility, because most golfers could never get all the way to here, like at P7, and still maintain a bent trail arm and a bent trail wrist. And what allows him to do it is, if you look at his body motion, he opens his pelvis, he gets his trail shoulder well below, and it's moving down plane. And the further your trail shoulder moves down plane, the more easy it is to keep the trail arm bent and the trail wrist bent to well beyond impact. But during this period, I believe that there's no force being applied by the trail arm against the club shaft. All the force needed to move the club shaft during the late down swing from P6 onwards is performed by the lead arm, because there's no alpha torque due to the trail arm straightening action, which would cause the trail palm to push against the back of the club handle through impact. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And this is an image of Scottie Scheffler. So here's Scottie Scheffler at P6. Yeah, image 2 is at P6.5, and here he is at impact. And here is Scottie Scheffler at roughly P7.4. Now notice the difference between Scottie Scheffler and Will Zalatoris. Notice that the club shaft is bypassing his lead arm, so that when he gets to P7.4, excuse me, his lead wrist is bending more than that of Will Zalatoris. And you can see his lead arm is not moving towards the target in the same manner that Will Zalatoris moves it. And you can see, therefore, the club shaft passes his arm and his lead wrist becomes bent. But notice that the club face is still square to his club head arc. In other words, what he's doing is what I call a flipping subtype of non-drive hold release. If you can do what Will Zalatoris was doing through impact, he used a hand release action, which I called a drive hold hand release action, where you keep the club shaft in line with your lead lower forearm and you don't allow it to bypass it during the P7 to P7.4 time period. But Scottie Scheffler is using a flipping subtype, and that's perfectly acceptable from my perspective, because if you look at the way the club face is moving through impact, it's remaining square. He's not rolling the club face closed. Now I want you to look at his wrist. You'll notice that his wrist between here at P6.5 and impact, it's straightening and also rolling counterclockwise, because he had to perform a lead forearm supination to square the club face. So here he is at impact, and you can see it's square. His club face is square. His trail wrist is straightened, and as he goes through impact, you see it's straightened more. But what's very important from my perspective is notice that he still maintains a supinated trail forearm. He does not pronate his trail forearm, which would cause his trail palm to roll over his lead palm. And if you look at the relationship between his trail palm, now it's almost fully straight, it's still behind the club handle and it never rolls over the club handle. And I believe that this happens passively. But to use your trail arm and forearm and trail wrist like Scottie Scheffler, look at what you have to do in the late downswing and through impact. Notice his trail upper arm is neutral here at P6. And you can see as his body turns, there's a small degree of internal rotation of the trail upper arm. But generally, it's very close to neutral, because as he turns, his pelvis opens up, his shoulder opens up. So you keep in your trail upper arm relatively neutral, you keep the trail forearm supinated, and then you allow your trail wrist to straighten passively. In other words, I don't believe that this is an active phenomenon. I believe that professional golfers like Scottie Scheffler is controlling the motion of the club shaft with the lead arm. And I will go into more detail now. But before I do that, I'm going to go to the next image. And this is the last image I'm going to share with you. And this is Vijay Singh. And this is Vijay Singh in his late downswing. And he has this very idiosyncratic phenomenon where his trail palm, you can see, loses contact with his lead hand and also with the club handle. And it starts before impact and continues through impact. And yet, that means to me that he can't possibly be applying a push force with his trail palm against the club handle in his late downswing and through impact, because it's not in contact with it. So I believe it shows to me that you can be a superb golfer, and Vijay Singh in his prime, a decade or two ago, was winning many major competitions. And yet you can see his trail hand was doing nothing, basically, in terms of controlling his club shaft or the club face. I believe that Vijay Singh was using a lead arm swing action, both to release the club and also to control the club shaft. Now I'm going to stop sharing images, and I'm going to go back and turn on my camera. So here I am. And what I'm going to now do is do a lot of demonstrations to emphasize a number of different points. And as I stated, I do these videos in my spare bedroom, and there's only 4 to 6 inches of space between this wall and the bed, and I use a very short club. So I'm going to start off with a fundamental point. Is if you, I'll do it with actually like this. Imagine you were thrown a frisbee backhanded, and you wanted to throw the frisbee so it traveled the maximum distance. If you stood like this and you just held the frisbee with your lead hand like this, and you just flicked it, it wouldn't go very far, right? Because that's the amount of force you're applying. If you wanted to move the frisbee and throw it a longer distance, you could go like this, take your lead arm further back, and then throw, moving your lead arm as fast as you can, and then letting the wrist straighten and throw. And that would require your lead shoulder girdle muscles to perform that throw motion. And you can generate, obviously, more speed that way. But if you want to maximize the throw action, then you would do this, right? You would turn your body, your pelvis, and then your upper body so that your back faces the target. I'm 77 years old, so I can't go to beyond 90. If you were young, you might, like Rory McIlroy, get another 30, 40 degrees of rotation. And then as you start the downswing, and you start with a pelvic rotation, then the upper body rotates. The left arm is catapulted towards the target. And you could generate a much faster speed of your left arm motion using what's called a pivot-induced lead arm swinging action. So you use the pivot to pull the club handle. It's a little more complicated than that, because in the early downswing, and I'll do it from this angle, it is going a lot downwards rather than targetwards in the early downswing. But the point I'm making is that I believe that professional golfers are generating most of their clubhead speed using the lead arm. So based on Sasha McKenzie's inverse dynamics calculation, this is what happens. So let's say you're at your end backswing position. The lead arm is pulling the club handle. That generates linear work. And in the average professional golfer, based on measurements from 3D machines, the lead hand reaches its maximum speed at about P5.5. So pull in there. The power to pull down comes from using your shoulder girdle muscles, but not only the shoulder girdle muscles, it's you catapult it by suddenly turning your pivot, and that moves it down. So there are two forces that move the lead arm down from P4 to P5.5. And as I said, that's when usually in most professional golfers, the lead hand speed reaches its maximum speed. Now, I mentioned to you that you can also generate clubhead speed by using the hand couple. So what is the hand couple? So the hand couple, as I mentioned, I'll do it from this angle, is here's your left hand and here's the right hand. They parallel to each other across the grip. And if you move in this direction, that's a positive hand couple. So the left hand is pulling in an uncocking direction, and the trail hand is straightening like that. And the two motions together apply a force against the club handle, and that's the hand couple. So according to Sasha McKenzie's calculations, in the early downswing, the hand couple is positive. So as you start down, not only are you pulling on this club handle with your lead hand, but the hand couple is applying a force. Now you would say, well, if it's applying a force, what prevents you from casting and losing your club head attack angle? And obviously, a professional golfer wants to keep his club head lag angle in the early downswing. And you do that by adducting your arm towards your side while keeping this bend. And the hand couple might be applying a force, but it doesn't cause you to prematurely lose your club head lag angle. From here, you can see at this point, P5.5, is when the hand couple becomes negative. And from here all the way to impact, it's negative. In other words, when people say, oh, they power the swing with a right arm throw action, according to the calculations by Sasha McKenzie, and he's not the only biomechanist who studied this. There's another famous biomechanist called Young-Hoo Kwan who studied it, and it came to the same conclusions, that this motion, the hand couple motion in the downswing to P5.5 is positive. And it produces, as I said, up to 50 joules of energy. And then from here, because it's negative, it's actually resisting the release of the club. So that impact, the total amount of work done by the hand couple is only about 30 joules compared to 238 joules by the lead arm pulling it. So let's go again to what I believe is happening in the downswing. So, as I said in my previous episode, episode 5, I talked about the intact left forearm flying wedge technique and a geometrically flat left wrist. And I use Scottie Scheffler as an example. So he goes down like this, and I'll do it with the left arm alone. The flying wedge is intact. It's always intact all the way to impact like that. It's intact. You have a geometrically flat left wrist, and the club shaft always remains in line with my lower radial bone, even while the club shaft is releasing. And while the club shaft is releasing, and I'll do it from this angle, it's releasing to catch up to the lead arm by impact. It's releasing on the functional swing plane like that. And if you use your trail arm in a synergistic manner, that it works in synchrony with the trail arm, you have to do this motion, right? So you come to here. At this point, Scottie Scheffler is already supinated because he shallowed his club shaft. From here to impact, he keeps the trail forearm supinated, right? And that function of the trail arm is to help guide it. You could do it with the left arm alone. You could, if you're skilled, you could
play golf with just the lead arm and be on the functional swing plane. But what professional golfers are doing is they're working together, which means it's doing this motion like that, keeping it on the functional swing plane. It's not applying any force. The swing power, as I said, is mainly done by the lead arm pulling on the club handle, generating linear work. So if you say, is it useful to think of a throw motion like this? I said, in a professional golfer, they look like this at the in backswing position. And I'll do it from this angle. The hand at the in backswing position is parallel to the swing plane on which you keep the club shaft at P4. As you come down from P4 towards P6, if you shallow your club shaft, watch what the trail form has to do. You have to adduct your arm. You have to get your elbow ahead. You can't do a motion like this. You can't internally rotate your arm. You can't pronate the forearm. You can't roll your wrist. This is the motion the trail forearm has to do, like that. It's a pitch elbow motion. The amount of supination depends on how much you shallow the club shaft. Then you're getting close to P5.5, and from here, you have to do this motion. So that your palm remains the club handle and is a release on the functional swing plane. Now, what's the difference between golfers like Scottie Scheffler and Will Zalatoris? So let's say you're releasing the club with the lead arm. So you've got a flying wedge, it's intact, you come to impact like that. This arm is supinated, but how straight should your wrist be during this time period? And that is optional, there's no rule. So the difference between Scottie Scheffler is that when he comes into impact, he looks more or less like that, the wrist is straightened. And that's simply due to the fact that his trail shoulder is that far back and his trail arm's more straightened. If you do like Will Zalatoris, you see that, getting the shoulder further, you can come into impact with a much more bent trail arm and a bent wrist. So that's optional how much you straighten your arm. It very much depends on how much you open your body and get your trail shoulder down plane. And during this period, as I said, the trail palm is not pushing on the shaft to make it travel faster. It just has a guiding function. Now, let's talk about the final topic, is what role does this trail arm have in terms of squaring the club face? And what amazes me endlessly is the majority of golf instructors that I've come into contact with and whose videos I've watched online believe that the trail arm controls the club face. And they believe that it's this motion. They say you come down here and you start to straighten your arm and pronate it. And you control the club face by pronating your arm to square the face, like you can see my trail palm rotating there. The problem with that is that it's not happening in professional golfers. This is the biggest revelation I've discovered in my 20 years of studying the golf swing biomechanics of professional golfers. And in episode 1 of my video project, I demonstrated the true facts is that the majority of professional golfers are supinating it. So think to yourself, here you are, you're supinating it. And then in the late downswing, and I'm going to go back to a golfer who needs to square the face. And that would be a golfer like Scottie Scheffler who uses a weak neutral grip. So here I have the club shafts in line with my forearm. I can only see one knuckle of that's a weak grip. So what Scottie Scheffler does, he keeps the intact flying wedge, gets to here, and then he starts to, as the club's releasing, he starts to supinate his forearm, and he gets into impact like this with a square face and with a desirable amount of forward shaft lean. This is done with the lead arm. I don't for 1 second believe that the trail arm can do it, because two things. The trail arm is supinating. Get to this position and try to roll your right wrist in so that it stays parallel to your lead wrist during this club face squaring action. And you'll find that because you've supinated, it's very difficult to actively roll it in that direction. I believe that any trail wrist, as it straightens and rolls counterclockwise, it happens passively due to a trail wrist circumductory motion. The other reason why I don't believe that the trail forearm plays a role in squaring the club face is that if you, like the people who say, oh, I use my trail, I just throw my arm and pronate and then square the face. That presumes that there's force being applied by the trail palm against the club handle to rotate it about its longitudinal axis in the late downswing between P6.5 and P7. But all the scientific evidence shows that this is not happening. There's no force being applied. So my feeling is this. Yes, if you say, is it useful to feel a throw action with a trail arm like that, like you're skipping stones? And I say yes, because it's a good feeling to, you see, if you do this like I'm doing it, then you're keeping your arm supinated, and then you don't worry about your trail wrist. It will straighten if the lead forearm is supinated. So if you use a weak or neutral lead hand grip and you have to supinate it, the trail palm will just keep on the club handle passively. But the throw motion, like skipping stones, is a useful one, but it's not intended to power the swing. Any power that the trail arm performs in the downswing is this. It's the hand couple power. Let's presume you didn't have a lead arm and you had to play golf only with your trail arm like this. So you're holding the golf club with your trail arm. You would take it back and you would do a motion which it looks exactly similar, right? But the power would have to come from you using your right shoulder girdle muscles. You move your right shoulder down plane because you didn't have a lead arm to power the swing. Then yes, of course, the trail arm would be responsible for powering the swing. But I believe that professional golfers are powering the swing with this motion. So the lead arm moves fast, then the club releases as you uncock your lead wrist, and you also control if you use a weak grip, then you have to square the club face. If you don't use a weak grip and you use a strong grip like this, you could just keep it more or less facing the ball target line as you uncock your lead wrist. Now, what's amazing to me, there's this debate among people like Brian Manzella, who believes in the concept of an alpha torque by the trail arm pushing the club handle into impact, while people like Sasha McKenzie and other biomechanists like Dr. Kwan and David Tuttleman, who's a golf physicist, and David Tuttleman has done a very careful analysis of Steve Nesbitt's work to show why it is essentially flawed. And what amazes me, if this debate among these different people, it's called the Alpha Wars. And the Alpha Wars is the question, does the trail arm apply a push force against the shaft? And that represents an alpha torque because it's working along the functional swing plane. And I'm saying, if people believe that, why don't they simply devise an experiment where they place pressure sensors on the club shaft like this? So when you hold a club like this, in TGM terms, that's from the golfing machine, this area over your left thumb here is called pressure point number 1. And when you put your hand on the club, the base of your trail hand often sits against pressure point number 1. And the lower part of your hand, particularly your index finger, watch, you put it on the club, it's applied here at this part of the club handle. And that's called pressure point number 3. And that is below the mid-hand point. So if you hold your hands like this, you can look at it any angle you want, but the mid-hand point is just below your index finger and then the trail hands below. So if Brian Manzella and Michael Jacobs believe that you should be applying a positive torque, then if you place the pressure sensor on the back of the club handle here and did a research study, you should be able to demonstrate that a positive push pressure is being exerted against the club handle. And yet they don't do this golf research study. And I am shocked that, there's one of the most important issues in our trying to understand how the golf swing works and trying to understand the role of the trail arm in a professional golf swing. One of the most important points of discussion is, does this trail arm in the late downswing, as the arm straightens, push on the shaft and make it travel faster? And a surprising number of golf instructors believe that they do, but there's no scientific evidence for it. In other words, why don't they clamor for a research study to resolve this issue? Because if you put on a pressure sensor on the pressure point number 3, you would be able to measure whether that's happening. Now, what I do believe is, watch this. I'm going to hold my hand open, but I'm going to hold it in the golf. If you said to me, in the late downswing, does the straightening arm apply pressure against the lead arm? And I could believe that. In other words, like this. Because during the late downswing, if you want to use what I call the drive hold hand release action, like Will Zalatoris, where the club shaft and the lead arm move like this through impact. It's not obligatory, it's just one technique of using the hands through impact. Then if you came with a straightening arm like the Will Zalatoris, and you're straightening your arm but keeping it bent, I could imagine you could put pressure on there. And it would be very interesting if people did a pressure sensor study and put pressure sensors over the base of your thumb to see if that's happening. But the most important part of a golf research study would be to put the pressure sensors on the club handle below the club coupling point to resolve this debate among people as to whether the trail forearm is pushing the club handle into impact. And obviously I'm biased, and I'm very strongly in favor of the opinions of Sasha McKenzie and Dr. Kwan, who state that the hand couple applies work to increase speed of the club handle only through the hand couple, and the hand couple's only positive from end backswing to about P5.5. After that, the hand couple is negative. Well, I've expressed a lot of biased opinions here, and for some of you, these opinions are new. For some people who already harbor opinions on this issue, you might not agree with what I'm saying. And all I can do is encourage those people who disagree with me to express their criticisms of my opinions by posting a comment in the comment section of my video. And I will look at those comments, any criticism expressed, and I will seriously indulge in a conversation where I answer any criticism that I receive. Well, this is going to end this video presentation, and I'm going to now stop the recording.